Okay. So I apologize. I will have to be speaking in English. My Spanish is very poor. I hope you don't mind, and I understand there is translation available. So I will be talking about scenarios to deal with uncertainties, with a particular focus on investment decisions. And that is also because I have a background in business and with a big company, and we take usually decisions to make investments, to develop strategies, and things like that. And that's a little bit my focus, but you can also consider this presentation from a perspective of policy decisions and other types of decisions. So the agenda looks as it is projected on the screen. I'll introduce myself a little bit more. Then we'll talk about the difference between forecasts and scenarios. I'll discuss some examples from business, and primarily from Shell, my company. I will be talking about how you make decisions using scenarios. I will touch on how to develop scenarios. What are some techniques, very briefly, obviously. And I'll have a hypothetical example in the Costa Rican context that I made up myself, and that is obviously incomplete and maybe not very appropriate, but at least something that can be used for discussion or to illustrate the concepts. And lastly, I'll have some conclusions. So first about myself, I've worked for Shell for 35 years. So Shell is an Anglo-Dutch oil and gas company. I've spent time in Indonesia, in Thailand, in the United States, in the Gulf of Mexico. But most of the time I was in the Netherlands, and the last 5 years of that period I was in corporate strategy and planning in The Hague. And that in that corporate strategy and planning department is the place where the famous Shell scenarios are developed, and where there's a lot of attention for what's happening in the world, because Shell is a global company, and energy is very much related to geopolitics and the way the economy develops. So it's very important to have a good understanding of that business environment, that broader macro environment, when you make your investment decisions and when you develop your strategies. I left Shell in 2015, and I started my own, business, I wouldn't say, a set of activities that focus on how to deal with uncertainties when you make investment decisions. And I distinguish 3 pillars, 3 legs under this stool. There's probabilistic investment analysis and risk management, and those are rather quantitative, mathematical disciplines. And the third one is scenario planning that is less quantitative, that is more qualitative, in order to get to it's more a conversation about what direction the business environment, what direction the world may be getting in. But that's an important element of dealing with uncertainty when you make investment decisions or when you develop strategies. So those are the 3 areas I deal with. But obviously in this presentation, I will focus on the third one, the scenario planning part. So, forecasts and scenarios. So many companies and economic institutes have to make forecasts. They have to say, well, this is the way on which we plan. This is the basis on which we plan. You have to make forecasts, but they're often single line forecasts. They're just one path to a particular future. Perhaps there are some sensitivities, some slight, what ifs, but generally it's just a single path to a single world, to a single stage 5-10 years ahead. That's a forecast, and you need those. There's no doubt. You need forecast, you need planning, and so on. But in an environment where things might change, that is not enough. Take this example. What do you think we are looking at here? This is 1894 in New York, and this is horse manure in the streets, piled up in the streets of New York. And it was a crisis situation. Many cities in North America and in Europe were struggling with this problem. The horse shit, to put it unpolitely, in the streets. And there were conferences about that. And there were forecasts. They made forecasts of how many meters of that stuff would be in the streets in 1930. There were all sorts of projections being done. And obviously, as you know, it was not an issue at some point because the car came and got rid of the horse carriages, and the problem went away. So the forecast of those days about this particular problem that were made were in the end not very useful. So scenario planning is about different pathways trying to different worlds. So you really have different worlds. You imagine different worlds of the future, and obviously you have different pathways to go there. So scenarios are really alternative futures. That is a good way to describe what I mean with scenarios. What we do not mean with scenarios is what is often thought as you have, let's say, 3 price scenarios, a high coffee price, a medium coffee price, and a low coffee price. And you say, well, this is my coffee price scenarios, and on that basis I plan my business or whatever. That is not what I mean with the scenarios. Scenarios that I mean are about looking at the fundamental drivers that shape the world in the future, and not just looking at some few output lines like oil price or coffee price. It's a bit different interpretation than many people use scenarios. So it's a heuristic approach. It's qualitative. So scenarios are plausible narratives. They're storylines of the future. They are supposed to sort of span the uncertainty range, because they are dealing with uncertainties. Each scenario has to be internally consistent. It has to be logical. And what you see in practice is that you cannot cope with more than 4 scenarios if you make them, because then it becomes unwieldy. And so they're not forecast, they're not static, and they're not very precise. So the scope of scenarios are, you need to establish a geographic area, a set of themes. What are things that are important to you? Is it education? Is it economy? Is it politics? Is it energy? So you have to be selective in what type of topics you include in your scenario discussion. And you need to say, well, I want to look forward 10 years, I want to look forward 20 years or 30 years. Some of the Shell scenarios even go to 2100. And why do you think that would be? It is because the climate change issue is not something that will play out in the next 20 years. It's something that will play out over a whole century. So that's why it's important to take a very broad horizon for Shell to think about the future. Scenarios are sometimes called memories of the future. So internalize that. Think about what we mean by memories of the future. It means that you have already seen the future a little bit, to the extent you can, obviously. You've already thought about the implication of certain developments, and that means you can react more quickly if you see things happening that remind you of, hey, this might mean that it goes in that direction. So the purpose of scenarios are to engage, to have a public debate, to bridge gaps between constituencies, between people. Famous examples of scenarios are the 91 scenarios in South Africa after the abolition of the apartheid regime. The different groups in the communities in the country needed to get together to collectively think about the future and what direction South Africa would need to take. And those were the Montfleur scenarios. They are very famous. It's a very famous scenario exercise that was used for political purposes. But obviously you also use scenarios to make decisions, and I'll go through how you do that. So scenarios are really about making connections. What are logical combinations of outcomes of uncertainties? That is what this is about. So you see here a diagram with, let's say, 5 uncertainties, and for each uncertainty you say, well, it could be this, that, or this. The trend could go this way, it could go that way, it could go the other way. And then you do that for every uncertainty. And we'll discuss some of those uncertainties later. And then you string them together to make a logical story. Not all outcomes of uncertainties logically stack up in a logical way. So that is really the essence of scenario planning. Looking at the fundamental drivers, looking at the fundamental uncertainties, considering some outcomes, and then putting them together in a logical way, and then creating a story about that. So what are some examples of scenario projects? I already mentioned the Montfleur scenarios in South Africa. Some countries do this, so Australia, South Africa. The World Economic Forum is very active in scenario planning. If you look at their website, you will see many scenarios on oil price, on specific country scenarios, and other. And obviously in the energy world, scenario planning, and that's where I come from, is used by some companies, not by all. So Shell is the main one, but there is also Statoil, which is now called Equinor because they don't like the word oil anymore, and ConocoPhillips and some others. And I know, for example, the energy companies in the Netherlands, also use the electricity companies. They use scenario planning. And I'm sure some other businesses do as well, but it's not very widespread. It's not a technique that is really pervasive across industry or across all the institutes, economic institutes. I don't know why that is, but that's just a matter of fact. So the key thing for scenario planning is that it needs to be plausible. I mean, it's scenario planning sort of speaks to the mind of people. They find that interesting, and they love to sit together and dream about the future. But you don't want to get into fantasies that are not relevant and that are not plausible. In Dutch, we call that cycling in the air. Yeah? So things that make no sense. On the other hand, you don't want to get into the tunnel vision either, that you say, well, it's been like this and it will always stay like this. You don't want that either. You want to, the whole idea of scenario planning is to get away from that. The tunnel vision can be a forecast. That can be a tunnel vision. And you want to get away from that, but you don't want to get into this cycling in the air mode as well. And that's the difficult part. What is plausible and what is worthwhile to spend your time on, and what is really, fantasizing and having fun, but not really relevant. So let's look at some examples now from Shell. And first I will go through the scenarios that were made in 1992, looking to a period to 2020, and now it's 2018. So it's interesting to see what they said in 1992 about the period up to 2020. And I'll look at the Shell scenarios that are today, and I'll look at some of the Statoil scenarios. So the Shell scenarios of 1992, remember, go back in time. Reagan had just left office, Thatcher had just left office. It was a time where it was recognized that we were at the start of a wave of liberalization and globalization. That was the mindset in those years. And the Shell scenario team said at that time, okay, that is the case. So we will look at a period of, very heavy liberalization, globalization in the next 1 or 2 decades. And that can be very beneficial. So there can be a lot of benefits from that. That can create a lot of economic growth. But they also said it can also invoke a reaction. There can be a resistance to globalization. It can also have a counter effect. And so they saw those 2 things, and they made 2 scenarios. One that would discuss the positive side of globalization, and the other one that would discuss the negative side of globalization. And so one was called New Frontiers, markets opening up, emerging economies developing, a lot of collaboration between countries, and obviously a lot of economic growth. And why is that important for Shell? It's important because a lot of economic growth means a lot of energy use, and it means a high oil price, basically. And so those are the logical conclusions you can draw from a world like that. But they also said, but watch out. What also can happen is that there can be resistance against globalization. There can be nationalistic tendencies. There can be a tendency of protectionism. There can be a tendency to go away from trade deals that cover many countries and focus on bilateral trade deals. And obviously, you can imagine that what you see around now, if you go north a little bit, and in many countries in Europe, these are things that are happening. And in 1992, they were already thinking about that these things like populisms, protectionism because of globalization could take place. And I think that was quite insightful or quite interesting that they already foresaw those type of reactions to globalization in those days. And here is an example of what's in that report in terms of the political spectrum. In those days, you had a very clear left-right political spectrum. Socialist parties, middle parties, more conservative parties. And that was it. 3, 4 parties, that was it. In many countries. But they said, in the barricade scenario, you will have a splintering of the political landscape. You will have more fundamentalist parties. You will have nationalist parties. You will have populist parties in that world. And it said, coalition building will be difficult in that world. And you've seen what's, I don't know how it is in Costa Rica, but you've seen what is happening in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in the Netherlands. Coalition building is more difficult. And that's what already they thought in 92, that might be the result of this development. So I think it was a lot of foresight that was embedded in those scenarios. And so they already thought about the reactions that could take place on the basis of these global developments. But then, Shell made more scenarios later in the 90s. And this was the scenarios in 98. And they had some different scenarios, and they said at that time, well, this barricade thing was really a little bit implausible. We don't think that will happen. So they made 2 scenarios that were basically new versions of this first New Frontiers, this optimistic scenario. And they forgot about these possible resistance against globalization and things like that. And that's an example of tunnel vision. You narrow your mind to a particular set of scenarios, and you forget about the things that can happen beyond that. And that's because, obviously, they were very influenced by the mindset in the 90s, which was rather optimistic, a lot of economic growth, the time of the new economy, the Fukuyama end of history story, and things like that. So even a Shell scenario team was influenced by those type of developments in the world, and they narrowed their vision. So the lesson here is that it's very difficult to find the sweet spot of what is plausible, but yet not too narrow. So the current scenarios of Shell are these. I just mentioned them. I don't go into much detail. I have participated in those as well. There are mountains and oceans. Mountains is a scenario where the elites sort of reinforce their power. And oceans is a scenario where power is more dispersed across a multitude of stakeholders within societies. And obviously, if you look around you, you will see elements of both in the real world happening. And there is, recently this year, there was a third scenario called Sky. And that's really not a geopolitical scenario. It's really an energy scenario, which asks the question, what do we need to do to achieve zero carbon emissions in 2070? What are the things that we need to do? So it's more a backcasting scenario. So you say, well, I have a target. That's another example of what you can do with scenarios. I have a target at a certain year. What needs to happen in order to achieve that target? And obviously Costa Rica is already doing very well in this space, I understand, and in terms of zero emissions, at least from the electricity sector. But that is the last scenario. I just mentioned these. Now, Statoil, Equinor, so Shell makes scenarios every 5-6 years, or sometimes 3 years. Statoil makes them every year, and I think that's an interesting practice. They update them every year, so they call them the same, but they update them every year on an annual basis. So they just sort of, you get new insights and you change them somewhat. And they have 3 scenarios. They're called reform, rivalry, and renewal. Reform is a little bit like a projection of the current world. Renewal is a little bit like the Sky scenario, that, you know, what do you need to do to get to a zero emission world in 2060, 2070, with a very positive twist to it in terms of collaboration between countries and things like that. And rivalry is a scenario where there's a lot of resistance against the climate change problem, where there is a little bit like barricades. So that scenario is rivalry. So if we now look at these things that are happening in the world, if you take rivalry and if you take renewal, where would this fit? Renewal or rivalry? So if you think it's renewal, raise your hand. If you think it's rivalry, raise your hand. Okay. And this one, is this renewal? Raise your hand. Rivalry, raise your hand. It's difficult, apparently. So this is, again, obviously, rivalry, yeah? I would say. But this is more like renewal. The trade agreement between Europe and Japan, that fits in the renewal scenario, that fits in the New Frontier scenario and things like that. And on this one again, obviously, fits the rivalry scenario. So the message here is that you will never get exactly into a scenario. There's not one of the 3 or 2 scenarios that will exactly happen. You will always have in practice elements of multiple scenarios that you will be observing. It may be that one scenario is more true than the other. So the emphasis, and you could argue maybe we're now a little bit more in the rivalry scenario or in the barricade scenario. You could argue that. But it's never exactly that. Scenarios are not, so it's not, with scenarios, it's not that you have 3 or 4 scenarios and in the end you say, oh well, it was number 3. That's not going to happen. You will always have elements of all of them. Scenarios are just exercises to think about what might happen and how things hang together. So now let's look at scenarios and decision making. What do you do with it? Suppose you have these scenarios, how do you make decisions? Well, there are 3 ways to do that. One way is to shift the mindset of decision makers. So a scenario exercise is very much a structuring of a conversation about the future. And if you want that to have effect, you will need to take decision makers along in the journey. And now I would like to introduce Pierre Wack. Pierre Wack is the founding father of the scenario practice in Shell, and in fact in business. Before, and he did that in the 70s, in 71, 72, last century. And he was a Frenchman, and he was brought to the central office to actually do this, because Shell at that time thought, we cannot just continue on the basis of a single outlook in terms of our business plan. And Pierre Wack then established the scenario practice in Shell, and that was the first time in business. The US military were already using that, of course. And I have here a short video of Pierre Wack. It goes back to the 86, so the people of my age will remember the days when we were presenting with sheets and in a dark room and things like that.
Usually, future-oriented studies have a very low effectiveness. Why is it? What makes the difference between an effective study and a less effective study? It has to do with basic psychology of decision-making. You and your neighbor, you have a mental model of the world in which you have to act. This mental model is based on your past experience and on the information you have internalized, you have digested. And when you have a decision to take, you confront different alternatives of behaving with this mental model. And when a man takes good decision, people say of such a man, he has a good judgment. In fact, he has largely a mental model which is a good match of the real world. We call this internalized model microcosm, as opposed to the real world macrocosm. I would like to suggest that unless you change the mental model of a decision maker, nothing is going to change. He may look interested, but his behavior will not be affected. The point I want to make is the following. The purpose of planning is not to produce a document. What will the world of energy look like in 10 years' time? The purpose of planners is to change the mental map of their critical decision maker. Unless this happens, nothing will follow. It will be like water on a stone. The difference between a decisive company and a company which is less so is largely that in the first case, the worldview, the mindset is clear, or it is fuzzy. This realization from wanting to produce a document which you will not be ashamed of later, with a new target, which was to change the image of reality in the head of the critical decision maker. This is a fundamental switch. It is a revolution in planning, which is as important as when a company switches from selling to marketing.
So that was Pierre Wack. So I was very glad we could be joined by the expert, the original expert. He died, by the way, in the late 90s. But this is a video you can still find on YouTube. And it has a lot of words of wisdom, even though it dates back several decades. Many things he says still apply today. The second, so it's important to take your decision makers and get them along in the journey of scenario planning. Otherwise, just to send them a document, it doesn't make sense. The second way you can use scenarios is by what is called wind tunneling. So that comes from designing an aircraft. You put it in a wind tunnel and you test it. In this case, you have a number of strategies for your company, and you test them against different scenarios. And it's a qualitative discussion, and it's a way to structure that discussion using the scenarios and using the different strategies. Now, we did that in Shell when we said, okay, what company does Shell want to be in 2035? Just an oil company or a broader energy company? Two different strategies, and we had two scenarios. So we had discussions about each type of company in each scenario. What would the implication of this scenario? And the outcome of that is mainly the insight that you get from that discussion. It's not a sort of a recipe. Okay, from this it follows that we do this and this. It's a way to get your mind around some of the important issues that play in the world. And the third way is more quantitative, where you try to indicatively, at least, translate the scenarios to quantitative inputs to your financial models. And then if you make an investment decision, you can say, the value of this investment decision, the value of this opportunity, under different scenarios is, and it is not a single number, they're bars in this example. So there are ranges. You cannot pinpoint the value of an opportunity as one number. There are so many uncertainties, you have to have a range. But then you see what the value of an opportunity is under different scenarios. And that gives you a lot of insight to what does this scenario mean for me. And that's the third way of using scenarios in decision making. But never, as you can see, will we have a final outcome with a single number that tells you yay or nay. That's not the case. You always have to think about it yourself, and actually that's what decision makers get paid for. If you can calculate everything to a single number and then it is clear what you should do, then we can get rid of decision makers. We can automate the decision making process, but that is not possible. So now, scenario development. How do you actually get to scenarios? Well, I will discuss two methods. There are more, but there's the deductive method, and this is what you will see a lot. And that is when you take all the uncertainties and you plot them in an impact uncertainty map. So on your impact on for you as a business, or for you as a country, or for you as a what your objective is. And then you take the two most important uncertainties and you take the extreme outcomes. So in this case, I just said low X, low high, and so you get a matrix of four possible combinations of those outcomes. And this is what is called the deductive method. It is a bit mechanistic. You just follow a process of doing this, and you get to your starting points for your scenarios. You have to fill them in with additional. And it's not the way we use in Shell, but it's a way you see a lot. So whenever you see scenarios presented by some institute, and they have 4 scenarios, they're likely arrived at through this method. There's also the inductive approach, which says you have a workshop, and maybe not just one workshop, but many workshops, and you also need to do desktop studies and things like that. And you have many issues that are important, many uncertainties, and for each uncertainty, you have a particular possible outcome. And you write that outcome on a piece of paper and you stick it on the board. Either literally or and then then you group these outcomes in some logical way. Using your intuition, using your logic, you group these outcomes, and then you have, let's say, the first skeletons, the first passes of 3 scenarios in this case. That's the inductive way, and it's very iterative. You cannot get it right in one go, but it's the way you can develop scenarios using the inductive method. Now, scenario development can be very big. It can also be small. In Shell, it's big. It takes about a year or a year and a half to develop these scenarios because there's a lot of studies. Experts are flown in. There are many workshops, there's workshops on technology, on economics, on politics. So it's well documented, well rehearsed. And then you start putting together in this way the scenarios. But you can also say, well, let's this afternoon with a few people from this audience, we go sit in a room and we take, let's say, Costa Rica, and we make some scenarios for Costa Rica, and we just use our own existing knowledge. And you can already get a long way with that. It's not perfect, and it's not maybe the basis of investment decisions, but at least you get a first pass of some scenarios using this approach for Costa Rica or for your municipality or whatever. Because you use the knowledge that's available in the minds of all the people using a structured process. But obviously, if you want to do it serious, you may need to do some desktop studies, you may need to interview experts, you may get some other people in and so on. But you can already do something small, and that's already useful with a small group with the knowledge available in the minds of people. So now I will have a few thoughts on the Costa Rica context. And I just made this up, and you can challenge it, I'm sure, very easily. But it's just to illustrate it and to bring it home a little bit. So let's say I'm a company, I would like to consider an investment in Costa Rica, and I would look at it from a distance. Yeah, I'm not an actor in Costa Rica. I cannot say, well, let's do this, let's do that. That's not my role. I'm just looking at what might happen as if I want to develop a company here. So what are some of the issues that Costa Rica faces? Uncertainties that may turn out this way, that may turn out that way, or that may turn out to be a non-issue. Regional stability. That's clearly something that might play a role. Economic growth. Costa Rica has been doing very well, but in the last few years, it's lagging behind its peers in Latin America a little bit. Why is that? How is that developing? The infrastructure. What will happen with the infrastructure? In many countries, infrastructure is a problem, and also in Costa Rica. And the question is, how will this evolve over the next year? And that's important for me as a businessman if I invest. Then there is the government budget issue. If you see here that, in the graph here, for a European country, this would be wonderful. 60% of GDP debt, it would be fine. But for Costa Rica, it has been on a trend upwards. And the question is, why is that? Will that still continue, or will that be dealt with? Wages are relatively high. Will that continue? Inequality is rising, whereas if you look at Chile, it's going down. And if you look at Venezuela, remember when Chavez came to power, it was at the time of 10 years of rising inequality. And there were more issues, as you will know, low oil price, maybe other things that I'm not aware of, but inequality was rising in the decade before Chavez came to power. And then there is the trade issues in the Americas. What will happen there? So there's some questions. I don't know the answer, but I know there are uncertainties and there are issues. So what you can do with these uncertainties and issues is this little game that I just explained. You brainstorm, you think about what the outcomes could be, And you try to make logical combinations of those outcomes. And then you can start to develop some narratives for storylines for those outcomes. And then you may have some first pass scenarios for what Costa Rica might look like in 20 years from now or 10 years from now. And that's important because I want to establish a business, and I don't know whether that is going to work. What I'm considering is to do something with e-bikes. And what you see here is in the Netherlands, and it's called a bakfiets. And they now have electric ones. And they do everything with it. They take their children to school. They use them to secure their beer supplies. They're used by the postman to deliver the post in the street. So they're used to quite a bit, and it's a growing, you see them more and more in growing business. And the question is, would something like this be of interest to Costa Rica as a solution to solve the traffic problem? You would say, no, that would not be feasible because look at all the streets. But yesterday I was in Cartago and I saw this. Because this is what you need in terms of infrastructure to allow those investments to take off. You need this. But if you have this, then it could be an interesting proposition. It's electric. You don't have to pedal too hard. You don't sweat. It's small, fast. It could be a great opportunity. But the question is, what do I need to think of in order to make an investment in this? So the question is, should we invest in a facility to import, or maybe better to assemble e-bikes in support of the eco-evolution of the transportation system in San Jose? So what you have here then is on the right-hand side, what you see is an influence diagram. I'm now mapping out all the factors, all the uncertainties, and there will be more than what I've done, that play a role in that drive the attractiveness of this investment, and where I can use the scenarios to help me think that through. So in the end, on the right-hand side, you see investment profitability. That's in the end my goal. You may have multiple goals, but let's keep it simple and say investment profitability is my primary goal. Then I look what influences that investment attractiveness, that investment profitability, sales volumes, costs, tax, and then I look what influence those. Consumer preferences. Will people be willing to buy a thing like that and ride it? I don't know, but that might be influenced by how societal eco-developments will go. And we don't know that, but we can maybe make some assumption around that. Costa Rica government policies in this space, in terms of infrastructure, are important. What are they going to do? What might happen in the policy making? But a very important thing is also the finances. Will there be enough money for the infrastructure that I just showed? So where is that finance going to depend on? On economic growth. What is economic growth going to depend on? It's the regional stability, and it's going to be how the trade is going to develop in the Americas. That will also then affect the wages. The wages are important both for me as a cost, because it's a cost factor, but it's also important that if people have money to spend, they might not do away with their car, so they will need to spend additional money on this. So you see how everything hangs together. And what I need to map out to think if this hypothetical business proposition is going to be viable. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. I just present it as a bit of a joke. but it may be real. Who knows? And if you know how everything hangs together, and you know what your scenarios are and how things may pan out, you can inform yourself about scenarios and how that might affect this particular business proposition. So that's basically how it works. You make these scenarios, then you zoom in on your business proposition, you map out all the factors that might influence it, and then you check back with the scenarios. What have I learned from the scenarios, and how can I use that to think about my business proposition? But then you look wider than if you just start from your business and think about a few things that, and you ask a few simple questions. This goes beyond that and really allows you to think broadly about the business environment in which you're going to make this proposition. So that was a hypothetical example, and it just meant to give you a bit of feel of how that scenario thinking would work. So now you come to the conclusions. Just to reiterate a number of things. So scenario planning is a way to get to grips with the contextual uncertainties of the business environment. These are not forecasts. The essence is to understand how things hang together. And I've distinguished 3 ways in which scenarios can help you in decision making. First and foremost, and this is really how it worked in Shell, is about influencing the minds of decision makers. Allow them to see different things and think about different things than the business as usual. And the second way is this methodological wind tunneling approach. You look at scenarios, you look at different strategies, you compare them. And the third way is more quantitative. You zoom in on a business opportunity and you calculate something in the context of the scenarios. And economists and financial analysts like that. And then lastly, scenario planning is a great foundation. It is not strategy planning. One mistake that is often made is that as soon as you talk about scenarios, people start saying, well, we should do this or we should do that. And we have a solution here, we have a solution there. That's not what you want to do. You want just to take a distance and look at the world and not find solution, but just describe what might happen. And if you've done that, then you can think about, we can do this, we can do that, we can do such, and then it's a great foundation for strategy. Thank you. Gracias.